All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Father Martin, for that kind introduction. I'm going to try to project here. I did have a few preaching courses in my day, but they weren't at Aquinas Institute, so I don't know. I'll try to get my projection going, and maybe the microphones will arrive. But is this okay? Can everybody more or less hear me? Okay, all right. All right, well, today we are here to talk about sacraments and sacramentality in everyday life. And I think, in my experience, when most Catholics think, well, I'm going to a talk about the sacraments, right? We start kind of surreptitiously counting on our fingers. Are we going to get up to 7, or are we missing a couple? And if you're missing a couple, you're probably missing maybe confirmation, maybe anointing of the sick. Sometimes those are the ones that kind of fall down by the wayside. And of course, if there are any Protestants among us, you have an easier life. You only need 2 fingers, usually, for baptism and Eucharist, although most liturgically minded Protestants would also say that matrimony, ordination are important rites, if not technically sacraments. So, well, I'll keep going. We may get a mic at some point here. I'm here to talk to you today about the sacramental framework that supports the 7 sacraments. And I'm not really talking about history here in particular, although we could go in that direction. But I'm talking about kind of a worldview, an understanding of God and creation, a theological anthropology, ooh, excellent, that supports, how's that? Is that good? All right. All right. I'm going to at least put my papers down here. That supports our understanding of the sacraments. And by that I mean that the sacraments are given to us by God, and as part of that, they fit really perfectly into our human existence. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. Sacraments, sacramentality, and everyday life. And since this is a dialogue, my intention here is to spend some time giving you my thoughts, and then pausing for some table conversation for you to dialogue with each other, maybe to share a little bit back with the large group, and then I'll come back in with kind of another layer here. So that's how I hope our day will go. And you're certainly very welcome to stop me with questions at any point. So if you feel like I've jumped over some key argument that just doesn't make sense to you, wave your hand and I'll definitely stop and we can consider that. So I want to start with the idea of God as creator of the universe and of us as human beings. Ooh, I have a clicker. Thank you. Oop, not yet. Okay. There we go. All right. All right, not yet. We have the accounts in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 of creation, right? Of God creating human beings in the midst of a world, in the midst of a garden, in the midst of plants, of animals, of other creatures. And we are distinct in that, but we are not separate from that, right? We are in that created world. We are a part of creation. We have the Psalms, which tell us that God knows us. Our next speaker in the series will be talking about the Psalms, Sister Mary Beth Howell. The Psalms say that God searches us and knows us. Jesus tells us that God knows every hair on our heads. God knows when we sit and when we stand. And as human beings, we know that everything that we have, everything that we know comes from God. And that's even true of our faith, right? That our faith is not something that comes from us as an individual that I decide, but even our faith is a gift that God offers to us. Before I came to the Aquinas Institute, I taught undergraduates for 8 years, and I used to tell them that studying theology, it's not like being some creepy stalker who is peering in the window trying to figure out what God is doing, and God doesn't want us to know. It's not that at all, right? It's an invitation that God offers to us, inviting us to know God, and that our very creation, our way of being in the world, the way that we fit into the larger created world, sort of equips us for that relationship that we're invited into, right? And we can say we don't have to do that, right? We're not forced, but that we have the capacity as human beings to be in relationship with God, and that is a gift of God. So this is kind of theological anthropology, right, as a background. This is what are we like as human beings? How do we relate to God? How do we fit into the world around us? All right, does that make sense? so far. We are created with and in the context of the rest of creation. We are invited to know God from the very beginning of our existence. And yes, this is important for understanding the sacraments, which is where we're going. So, this invitation comes to us in ways that make sense to us as human beings. This is part of God knowing us, and in the incarnation, and in creating us, that we learn things from God in ways that make sense to us. And here I'm going to turn to Thomas Aquinas. Here we go. Always a good place to start, especially when you work at the Aquinas Institute. Thomas Aquinas tells us that God meets us where we are. That's the 21st century language. In the 13th century, Aquinas put it a little bit differently. He said that signs are given to human beings so that they can achieve an awareness of things which they do not know through things which they do know. And this is in the Summa Theologica. It's in the third part. Question 60, Article 2, for those of you who are keeping track. Question 60 Aquinas asks, what is a sacrament? And then there are several articles. In the second one, he's talking about signs. And so he says, just like any good teacher, God starts with what we know, and then moves on to the things that we don't yet know, but building kind of slowly. And so when we think about this, what is it that we know? When I think about that, as I was preparing this talk, I was thinking, what is it that we know just as human beings? Not necessarily as people with theology degrees, not necessarily as people who work in the church, in parishes, just what do we know? And I was thinking, we know our everyday life, right? If you think about what you did this morning, family routines, packing your lunch, although maybe not today, right? Because we were treated to a nice lunch. Packing lunches, running errands, working around the house. I took advantage of this snowy, rainy weekend to do some work around the house. Our professional commitments, our school commitments, our volunteer commitments, all of these things that we do just as a matter of course. And I was also thinking about our everyday life, the places where our needs as human beings and our joys as human beings kind of intersect. And that could be something like sharing a meal together here, right? We need food. We all needed our lunch in some way. But this was an especially pleasant lunch. It was a nice lunch. And we share it in good company, right? With people that we maybe came with, or people that we've met at our tables. So this is an everyday experience that is a human need, and it's also something that gives us joy. We can also think about the everyday life as the places where sometimes our griefs emerge in everyday life, right? Our sorrows, our anxieties, those are also human. None of us get through without that. So we could think in the last month or so, we may have had some instances of anxiety or fear or sorrow. Those are also part of our human everyday life, right? Sometimes something stands out as particularly joyful or particularly difficult or sorrowful, but we're going along. And these are what we know about what it means to be human, about what it means to be living in our creation, functioning in this world that God has given to us. And Thomas Aquinas very wisely says that when we're thinking about the signs in the sacraments, where God is building on those things that we know, right? The errands that we do, the work that we do, the enjoyment that we have, the recreation that we have, the sorrow that we have, those are all things that are signs for us, and they also just build into from our everyday life into something that we can learn about God, something that is revealed to us, but in a very kind of close, kind of homey way. All right, so does that make sense? Good. All right. So as we think about that, I want to invite us into thinking about one more term here. Another term from the title of my talk, which was conveniently up there for a while, the term sacramentality. And this may be familiar to some of you, it may be unfamiliar to others of you. When we think about the 7 sacraments, yes, but sacramentality is a theological principle that doesn't get mentioned too often, but I think as you think about it, you'll think, yeah, I know what that is, right? This sense, the theological principle that all created reality has the potential to mediate the presence of God. So this sacramental principle is building on the idea that Aquinas gives us, that we start to understand things that we don't know by means of things that we do know, by saying that all created reality, our lunches, our friends who are at the table, our family members, outdoors, whatever we see when we look out the window there, has the potential to mediate the presence of God. And that this is a foundational idea for the sacramental system. Right? If you think about that, we'll get into it a little bit more, but if you think about it, our 7 ritual sacraments are building on rather everyday things that the Catholic sacramental system argues have the potential to mediate the presence of God, both in the ritual context and in the larger world. So I want to invite us here to take our first point of table dialogue, and to invite you to think for a minute at yourself, and then with the people at your table, about how you have experienced the presence of God in the created world broadly understood. And I'm going to invite you here to not jump to the 7 ritual sacraments immediately. Question? Yes?
Your definition there says that all created reality has potential to mediate. Why is it only potential?
That is an excellent question. I think you can answer it in a couple of ways. One is that sometimes we can try to stand in the way of it. You could certainly think of probably an instance of created reality, and by that I don't mean necessarily just a tree, but you could also think about this building, right? This building, you could say, is the work of God and the work of human hands, but it is part of our world. We could get in the way of that. God could then overcome the obstacle that we try to put in the way of that. But the principle holds that it at least has the potential. Does that?
So it depends upon our perceiving it as the presence of God, or our utilizing it to make God's presence.
Well, I don't know that we're necessarily using it. Some of it might have to do with our perception. The example that often comes up in this question of the potential is, what about really horrible things that human beings do? I was watching a documentary last night about something I know nothing about the beginning of World War II in Shanghai. It was on PBS, maybe some of you saw it. And the images of that were just horrible, right? So a war, that is a human creation, right? There's a lot of evil there. I would not want to say that I would still say there is potential within that context for the presence of God to be mediated, but there's also potential for human beings to get in the way of that, right? So I think the Catholic approach is basically a very optimistic approach, that the world has the potential to mediate the presence of God, but especially in ecumenical dialogue, I think this is a place our ecumenical dialogue has been helpful, and if I were up here with a Protestant colleague, I think that person might be saying quickly, hey, what about sin, right? What about sin? And that's where we have to keep a little bit of a check. Yes?
So
Yes, or someone else could realize the potential. Yes. So it would certainly be possible for the presence of God to be mediated through an unwitting person, right? Or an inanimate object. The intention of that person or object is not necessarily necessary. But yes, it has some things to do with our perception and the way that we're human and the way that we learn and understand things. All right, thank you both for those clarifying questions. You want to take a few minutes here at your table to kind of think of a concrete example for yourselves of how you have experienced the presence of God in the created world? I'll give you 5 minutes or so.
Let's bring those back out into the light. Pieces of art. I know when I went into that space, it's convention center. And when that space, and it's like the whole world we see.
Who's 68 years and are still so in love. There's the
So on this particular day, she just I gotta go. You said you would go, anything like your grandson's there, and I said, oh, okay, so we'll go. All right, it's your turn.
30 more seconds. All right, let's finish up your thought, your sentence. Bring your conversation to a pause, not necessarily an end. All right. What did we come up with? Anybody have an example that you want to share? I was eavesdropping a little bit. I heard some good ones. Yes?
What I observed in the table was that it should prevent prevailing images for grief and nature.
Grief and nature.
It was a blessing to be able to see the stories, and that's what they said.
Thank you. Okay. Yes. We have-
This morning, there were 2 phone calls, and both of them came in on the recorder, and I didn't answer either one of them because I was trying to move and get here. But one was a friend of mine who said, Marianne, I don't know if you have heard that so-and-so has died. And she was part of the Aquinas lovers, which all 3 of us were part of. And she said, but I just wanted you to know that this is the funeral home, and she's going to be laid out there. If you have any questions, let me know. I just knew that, first of all, I read the newspaper, I would not have known this, that was God speaking through another human being. And I just knew that because it was just out of the blue.
Thank you. Any other examples?
Call upon Sister Hughes.
Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is friendship. And I think that friendship is certainly a way that mediates for us the love of God. And the experience of a variety of friends shows us, the kind of the complexity and the variety in the experience of God from humankind. But we have lots of examples here.
Great, thank you. And that use of the word mediates there, right? That it means to go between, right? To be in the middle, to go between things that maybe don't naturally seem to go together. So friendship, people who are standing, or the phone call that you had, right? With standing between us and God in a way that kind of reaches out a hand in both directions, right? Bringing us together through this experience, through another person. I heard one person that I was eavesdropping on mention the Grand Canyon, I think, right, over in the corner. And I didn't hear the whole thing because I was kind of wandering, but I heard someone say something about water, right? That the Grand Canyon, that's not just water, right? That's water. That's water that has carved this path in a way that is almost incomprehensible to us. And yet that same water, right, is in those bottles on the table. It's in our baptismal fonts, right? There is something that we can take from seeing the Grand Canyon, seeing the water there, and start to understand about our sacraments, that we can hear in the voice of someone who calls to give us some news, some sad news, but some news that we need to hear, right? We can feel the presence and the power of God in that, just as we can see and feel the presence of God in a minister of the sacrament, right? In an ordained clergy person, in a couple that is getting married, who are administering the sacrament to each other. So our friendships, our relationships, our experiences of the natural world, all can kind of help us to understand the sacraments, the 7 ritual sacraments, a little bit more deeply. They can give us not just a sense that this is something that we are doing in our church context on Sunday morning or Saturday afternoon or whenever it may be, but that we can start to see these connections to the larger world of creation, and in which we are part of. We play our role as well, and we can start to take those baby steps that Thomas Aquinas is talking about, of going from the things that we know in our experiences this morning, on our family vacations, on our drives to work and school, as I heard someone mention, and start to think about how those inform our understanding of the everyday objects that are part of the ritual sacraments as well. Now, several of you mentioned people, right? Friendships, and I imagine that there were some particular people who were mentioned as experiences of the mediation of the presence of God. And that's where I went to as I was thinking about this. I'll tell you a little story. This was a long time ago. I was an undergraduate student. I was studying in Germany. And maybe you won't believe this, but I was, 20 or so. I had never been on an airplane before in my life until I decided to get on a transatlantic flight from Logan to Frankfurt by myself. So you can imagine I was having an interesting day. The person who was supposed to meet me at the Frankfurt airport did not show up. In the bottom of my bag, had the instructions of how to take the train and then the bus to get to where I was supposed to be. I did take the train, but I took the wrong train. It was going to the right place, but I didn't have the right ticket, so I had that. By the time I got to the train station in the city that I was going to, it was one of those subterranean train stations, and I was done. And I had one of those big suitcases before they had wheels on them. It didn't have wheels. It was just huge. It had all my worldly possessions practically, and I'm bumping it up the stairs, basically, trying to get to the top of the stairs. And as I was doing that, someone walked by me, and he said to me, "Can I give you a hand with that?" In German. And I said, "No, right? Don't touch my suitcase. It has all my worldly possessions, you stranger." And I said, "No, of course, I can do it myself." And he got halfway up the stairs, and I'm still bumping along, and he turned around and came back, and he said, "I am helping you." And he took that suitcase to the top of the stairs, right? So not the beautiful sunset necessarily, not the perfect experience of the created world where you see the splendor of God, but in a really not so great day, mundane, in its annoyances, a person comes and does a kindness, right? Offers some hospitality, some kindness, meets a need that you didn't really know you had until, here I am following this man with great relief up the stairs and assuming that he probably doesn't want to carry this any more than I do, so he's probably going to leave it at the top of the stairs for me, which of course he did. A lovely, kind person. But I think this leads us to think about another point here that has to do with the idea of encounter. And some of you, maybe, do think about the sacraments as moments of encounter. I see some nods. I see some thinking. I think that we are, in the 21st century, we are increasingly aware of God's presence mediated to us through encounters with other people. But we are also, sort of on the flip side of that, starting to think about the sacraments as moments of encounter with God. So I go from thinking I know what an encounter is. I encountered many familiar and friendly faces when I arrived here. Some of you encountered friends and made new friends at the table, right? I saw people exchanging embraces, right? We had some encounters. We had a sense of two people coming together, meeting each other, starting to know each other. And that's the thing that we know, right? We encounter people all the time. We encounter them at the grocery store, we encounter them in our neighborhoods. Occasionally we maybe have somebody that we don't want to encounter, and that can also be a little bit of a visceral feeling, right? We want to avoid an encounter at all costs for whatever reason. These are human experiences. So we go from knowing about what it means to encounter another human being or to have someone encounter us, to being able to think about the sacraments as an encounter with God in the particularities of a time and place, right? Just like we encountered each other in the particularities of a general interest in theological conversation or liturgy or sacraments or lunch or whatever it has brought us here today, this shared understanding. The sacraments also can be thought of as encounters with God in a particular context. Maybe it's a context of being spiritually hungry, and we encounter God in the Eucharist. Maybe it's a moment of moving into a new stage in the life of faith, ordination or matrimony, right? We encounter God in that particular context. Maybe it's a moment of realizing our need for reconciliation with one another, with God, with the church, and then we encounter God in the sacrament of reconciliation, right? Especially that one that is mediated through a conversation, through an encounter with another human being. So we can think about the sacraments in this way. I want to give you another slide here. I think I kind of skipped over one that's not too, that's just the question, right? What does it mean to encounter? This question comes on the theological scene thanks to the Dominican theologian Edward Skilovax, who some of you may be familiar with his work. He looks a little bit dour in that picture, but otherwise known as a very kind man, from what I understand, died not too long ago, and wrote a very famous book in the late 1950s called Christ the Sacrament of the Encounter with God. And Skilovax, writing prior to the Second Vatican Council, is really one of the reasons that we can think about the sacraments as an encounter today. He was one of those people who had that insight at that time. And he began, this is my little nod to the New Testament, he began with the Incarnation, right? He's a systematic theologian. And Skilovax says, personally to be approached by the man Jesus was, for his contemporaries in the first century, I'm adding, an invitation to a personal encounter with the life-giving God, because personally, that man, Jesus, was the Son of God. And he goes on and he says, Jesus' human redeeming acts are a sign and cause of grace. And we probably all remember a sign and cause of grace, right, is the traditional definition of a sacrament, right? That a sacrament is a sign and cause of grace in the world. Skilovax takes, following Thomas Aquinas here, he takes what was probably familiar to many people, the definition of a sacrament, and he says, Jesus is like a sacrament. We might now be more comfortable saying sacraments are like Jesus, but in this time, you can go either way. Skilovax is saying that meeting Jesus is like a sacrament because you meet a human person who appears just like you or me, right, in the first century, and that person is mediating grace, the presence of God, and is also a sign of who God is in the world. Jesus spends his life healing people, teaching people, being with people, doing the kinds of things that God is doing in our world all the time, and that we are called to do in the world all the time as well. Let me pause here. I see a lot of thinking going on. Anybody have a question that you want to articulate here at this point? Right, we can be thinking about our own understanding of encounter with our friends, with the people who think of us, when we need to be thought of, with people who reach out and help us in the moment when we really need some help. We can think about what that experience is like, what we know. And Skilovex kind of gives us a link to say, in the sacraments, God is issuing that invitation in the language that we know to encounter us as well, mediated through the everyday things that we have in our kitchens, most of us, right? The bread and the wine, the olive oil, the other people who are often in our kitchens, right? All of these sort of everyday elements of created reality, that those can be places, occasions, opportunities for encounter with God in the ritual sacraments as well. All right, so that idea of encounter and Skilovex giving us this opportunity to think about this and to think about the sacraments in a little bit more of a personal way. That a sacrament doesn't just mean my sins are forgiven now, right? An action was done on me, or I'm married now and I wasn't before, right? That these changes, these are instances of grace. They're instances of experiencing God's presence in a particular time and place, and that they can be thought of in a way that is analogous to encountering another person. All right. Well, why don't we pause here then for another point of dialogue at your tables, and you can think about what all of that means. I'm also going to give you another little discussion question here. How can an understanding of sacramentality deepen your understanding of the 7 ritual sacraments, right? That's really kind of what we're leading up to. We've talked about sacramentality, this potential for the created world to mediate the presence of God. How can that deepen your understanding of the sacraments? And you can think about that in light of encounter as well. Anybody have a burning question before I set you loose in your tables? Yes?
What about the person who chooses not to have an encounter with someone?
Right. Well, one can do that.
If there's a person that you really, I don't want to have an encounter with this, are you then being the obstacle, or perhaps where God might be mediated through that person? Or how does that fit in with an encounter? We talk about encounters that do bring the presence of God. If you, for some reason, don't want to have an encounter with a person, how does that influence?
Right. Well, that could put up an obstacle, right? We could talk about human beings putting up an obstacle to the work of grace in us. That could be an obstacle. I wouldn't want to go so far as to say that, I mean, if you don't want to encounter one person, right, a particular person, there might be a good reason for that. There could also be that encounter might not be the best analogy or the best way of thinking about how God's presence is mediated to you. So we could think of a person, probably not someone here, because such a person probably wouldn't have wanted to come, but a very shy person, or a person who just doesn't like to be with other people. That person could certainly encounter God through the created world in another way. And it would be possible. I'm sort of thinking of all of the exceptions here. But you could also say that somebody who just doesn't want anything to do with the world or other people, that could become an obstacle, I think, to the ritual sacraments as well as to the broader experience of God.
Is it conceivable to think of that situation as by encountering that person, you may be diminishing your own sense of sacramentality?
You could. You could also make, I guess I'm thinking of exceptions here, but one, could make an informed decision that this person is harmful to me. I have never experienced God in my relationship with this person before, and it's unlikely to start tomorrow, so I'm going to make a different choice. That would seem to me to be a reasonable choice to make.
We have some sense of responsibility for the integrity of our own sacramentality.
We have a responsibility of openness, yes. Yes. That's our kind of our job in terms of sacraments and sacramentality and our relationship with God, right? We're given this capacity. We can always choose not to. We have to kind of navigate our way in the world and seek out those places where we expect to encounter God. If any of you have Ignatian training in this room, right? The idea of St. Ignatius saying, finding God in all things, looking for God in all things, seeking God in all things. That is closely related to the idea of sacramentality, that we should we should be open to finding God in all things. We're not gonna make it so by doing that, but we're open. We're searching for that. All right, thank you. All right, why don't you take a few minutes here, 5 minutes or so, to think about this question. I have a few thoughts on it as well, so I will share those with you in closing. So take about 5 minutes. All right, finish up your thought, your sentence. Anybody want to share the fruits of your table conversation with the rest of us? This is kind of the why should we care question. Anybody want to give us a thought on what you talked about here? How does this deepen? How does this help?
I wanted to make a comment about the word encounter and the Ignatian principle of finding God in all things and all ways. I was taught that there was a mistranslation of the Spanish, and the word really should be encounter God in all things. And it's because if we use the word find, we're going searching, but God's already there. So the encounter is God's there waiting for us. And I think that's with the sacramentality, with the sacraments. We go in, God's already there. We come with open hearts and experience it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. That's perfect. I'll have to go back and check out the Ignatius in the original. Anybody else have a fruit of the conversation you'd like to share? All right. Well, we can talk some more. Let me add just a couple of comments in closing. One of the reasons that I think that this is helpful, that I care about this, is that I think it can be easy to think about the sacraments as rituals that happen in a particular place in a church, usually, right? Perhaps in a hospital or in a place that is sort of set aside for this, and we can forget that we share in the body of Christ so that we can go and do the work of Christ in the world, right? So that the Eucharist, for example, we haven't talked too much specifically today, is sort of a pivot, right? That we receive the body of Christ so that we can go out into the world and do what Christ did in the world, right? So to sort of be that point of encounter, we can ask ourselves, how do I feel about people that I encounter? But we can also ask ourselves, how do people feel when they encounter me, right? Not only am I open to seeking God, finding God, encountering God in all things, but am I open to being the kind of person that can mediate the presence of God to someone else? And I should be, because I participate in the ritual sacraments, in the Eucharist in particular, right? So this helps us, I think, to see the back and forth between our everyday life, our lived reality, our rituals that make use of that, and then the dismissal, right, where we're sent forth, right? Go forth, proclaim the gospel with your lives. That's what we're called to do. We're called to think of ourselves as kind of small s sacraments, right, as mediators of the presence of God to other people. And ideally the sacraments, the ritual sacraments, are something that we go back to be strengthened for that in particular moments. But if we lose that connection between sacraments, sacramentality, and everyday life, then we have three good ideas, but we don't really have the integration that God wants for us and that the church hopes for us as well in the sacramental system. So that's one. And I believe it's just about 1 o'clock, so I don't want to keep anybody, but I am happy to stay and chat with anybody who would like to. I thank you all for being here this afternoon, for contributing to this conversation, for helping me to think a little bit more deeply about this as well. So thank you.